It's 12:05, so we'll get started. Thank you so much to Sam and Perry for joining us today. We're so excited to see all of the wonderful efforts and research that Sam's doing at Coral Vita down in Grand Bahama Island. So we're so excited to have this opportunity. Perry Teicher and Sam Teicher, as you'll notice, do have the same last name. They are cousins. So that is no coincidence. So we're lucky to have this stellar cousin duo here. So I'll just do a quick introduction of Perry, and thank you for coming to join us on behalf of Impact Capital Forum. We're excited to have this opportunity, and we have many more events, as you'll note, on our website coming up. So please do join us. So Perry Teicher is a good friend and an impact finance attorney at Oric, Harrington and Sutcliffe. Perry represents and advises mission-driven entrepreneurs and investors with complex transactions and organizational matters. As Oric's impact finance attorney, Perry leads Oric's impact finance and investment practice. Oric's impact finance and investment practice serves a global client base across a range of sectors, leveraging Oric's unique capabilities to provide innovative, effective, and thoughtful legal services to those clients aiming to create positive social and environmental change alongside targeted financial returns. Perry served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kazakhstan, where he supported the development of businesses aiming to create mobility and opportunity for people with disabilities in the region. Perry is a member of the ROI community and Nexus, and involved with inclusive Jewish and community development global initiatives globally. Perry is also our sponsor for the Opportunity Zone Working Group. Are you laughing, Perry? Because I'm winded.
No, I'm laughing because you're reading my whole bio. It sounds much better.
Well, a plug for Oric. The plug for Oric too is that Perry is kind enough to provide gracious breakfast and scintillating information on opportunity zones and guidance as our co-host of the Opportunity Zone Working Group. So if anyone has any legal questions related to that, Perry's your guy, as well as impact finance. So thank you, Perry, for hosting again today. And thank you, Sam, for making time. And we're so excited to learn about all your great endeavors down in the Bahamas.
Great. Thank you. So this is, thanks for having us. This is really fun for me because I was able to go down and see Coral Vita in person pre-COVID, and we're in such a different place right now, but knowing sort of what Sam has built and what they've continued to build during both, during the last, how long has it been, 9 months, a year. I'm excited to be able to share that, to have Sam share that with everyone. And also I think, there's so many meaningful, interesting projects, climate challenges that are being addressed. I think what Coral Vita is doing is innovative, meaningful, and just really impactful. And so it's a pleasure, Sam, to be able to do this, even if we're not in person right now. So I was sharing this with a friend of mine, and they're like, his title is Chief Reef Officer. That's probably the coolest title at a company I've ever seen. So maybe just to jump in, you could share a little background on sort of what is Coral Vita doing beyond the headline. How did you sort of decide to start the company, and then maybe a little about why are you Chief Reef Officer and what do you do in that role?
Well, I'll start there since that's the easiest one to answer. It turns out when you run your own company, you can choose if titles matter or not. And my co-founder Gator and I effectively are co-CEOs, but we were just deciding what our title should be. And I don't remember what the occasion was, but maybe he was listening. There's a rapper, his name is Chief Keef. And I thought of Chief Reef Officer, and I've rolled with it ever since. But it definitely, if all else fails, I also now know I have a career as an MC, and I could just go simply by Chief Reef. But it all basically falls under the domain of running the organization's sales, fundraising, marketing, and basically try to make the ship sail that lets us actually go out and grow corals to restore the reefs. So that's in true practice what Chief Reef Officer entails. And yeah, that's a title that I never imagined for myself. I mean, growing up, I certainly wasn't dreaming of being a coral farmer. I'm from Washington, D.C. Potomac River, definitely not known for its illustrious, magnificent coral reefs, and had more of a background in policy and was thinking about education reform and national security, but ultimately studied climate change and the environment in college, and then got into grad school at the Yale School of the Environment. And the year before I went in, I decided to take a gap year and worked for my friend's NGO in the country of Mauritius out in the Indian Ocean that was doing educational work for at-risk kids, and he had me set up the environmental branch of the organization. And one of the projects I got going there was the United Nations Coral Farm. And this was back in 2012, 2013. And so with that lifelong love of the ocean, since I've been a scuba diver since I was a kid, had the opportunity to see a reef come back to life. It was spectacular. It was amazing. But it also became clear that the current model for reef restoration doesn't cut it for the scale of the problem. And to sort of outline that for everyone who doesn't know, we've lost half of the world's coral reefs in the past several decades. And we're currently on track to lose over 90% within the next 30 years by 2050. So we're basically already experiencing unprecedented loss of one of the most magnificent ecosystems on the planet, and within our lifetime could really basically see them disappear from Earth. They truly are the canary in the coal mine for climate change. And so we need to dramatically change how we protect and preserve them. And full stop, the best thing to do for reefs, not to hire Coral Vita, it's not to restore them, it's to stop killing them. Solving for climate change, pollution, overfishing, but clearly that's not happening at the pace or scale required. So we need interventions and adaptation solutions like reef restoration. And you can think of it as an adaptation solution for climate change. That's what coral farming is. It's akin to reforestation. Instead of growing trees to plant, we're growing corals. And that experience in Mauritius, let me see how a reef can come back to life, but that the existing model is largely grant and donation based. It's not going to scale. There's ecological limitations, which I can go into more detail on, as well as just the physical ability to do ecosystem scale restoration. And then ultimately to that financial piece, grants and donations, they really will only get us so far. And so in grad school, I met my co-founder Gator, which is truly his name. Brothers are Moose and Griffin. And we were thinking about big environmental challenges that government and academia and NGOs weren't solving at the pace and scale required. And if you take a step back and look at coral reefs, let's pretend none of us here care about the environment, they're really valuable. Reefs act like seawalls. They reduce wave energy on average by 97%. They generate tens of billions of dollars, conservatively possibly more, through reef-based tourism, snorkeling and scuba diving. And then a quarter of all marine life, together with 1 billion people around the world, depend on reefs for the habitats that they provide, for jobs, for livelihoods. And so as reefs die, you've got actually a serious socioeconomic catastrophe. And so I'll go into more detail about sort of the science behind everything that we do, but we basically said, well, what if we create a social enterprise, a business, where we sell reef restoration as a service to the hotels and governments and insurers and developers that depend on healthy reefs, that can then inject the capital required to scale up restoration, get it away from small scale grant funded projects, make it financially sustainable, and preserve reefs for the sort of the levels required. That led us to launch our first farm here in Grand Bahama. And we ultimately plan to launch coral farms all around the world and hopefully help galvanize an entire restoration economy to preserve the ecosystems that take care of all of us.
That's great. That's, I mean, really inspiring sort of what you built so far. I'm curious if, sort of taking a step back from the science, because so for everyone on the call, we're going to do a tour of the coral farm in a little. So maybe we can use some of that to dig into some of the science and sort of what's happening on the ground. But I imagine that people may also be interested in sort of the business side of being a social entrepreneur, and in a very unique space. And you had news recently that I saw that may be worthwhile to share, but then also just thinking about sort of what have the challenges been in really growing this as a business so far?
Yeah, so the news is that we've effectively reached our goal for our round, a $2 million round to transform this pilot farm in Grand Bahama into a world-class facility. which then puts us on a path to start launching these farms all around the world. So it's exciting on its own, but obviously to achieve that after Hurricane Dorian, which is a whole nother part of our story, came through and ravaged the Bahamas, and through COVID is a huge milestone. Still looking for a few dollars left to close that out, but like we're pretty much there, which is really exciting. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. A lot of times, to start up a business is obviously a challenge. To start up an impact-oriented business is an additional challenge, and then effectively to do one where we're also building the market is difficult, but also really exciting, because what we're basically saying is there needs to be a whole industry around ecosystem restoration. We're obviously focused now on coral reefs, but ultimately for mangroves, for seagrass, for terrestrial forests, there's so much capital tied in with nature that is often undervalued. People's livelihoods, the ecosystem services they provide for food, clothes, shelter, carbon sequestration, you name it. And so that was sort of what underpinned us launching this as a company. And we're still, there's an education piece to this as well, right? We often have to educate customers that as a hotel owner, you might not realize that reef off your shore is a huge asset to your operation. I mean, one time we had a guy come down, a manager with $1,000 Italian loafers on the beach, and was like, "What do you mean all of my stuff's on land?" But if you're trying to attract snorkel and scuba tourists, if you are worried about the insurance rates going up from more storms coming because that reef that was a seawall is dead, suddenly there's a recognition, oh, this is really actually valuable to what we're doing. So the two main ways we operate as a business are selling reef restoration as a service. We'll play on software as a service, and ecotourism. So if Perry was a hotel owner that relied on snorkel and scuba tourists, he could hire Coral Vita to restore the reef his hotel depends on. Same thing for a government with national economic interest, or an insurance company, or a cruise port. Any of these people can hire us to restore the reefs they depend on. Then our farms are on land, and there's a number of advantages that gives us. Traditionally, coral farms are out in the ocean, kind of akin to imagine underwater gardens. On land, as we grow the corals for restoration, we decided, okay, let's not just leave it as a production facility. Let's make these really interactive, fun places that ultimately are tourism attractions. Education centers as well for local communities. That's really core to our model, is to build capacity. So hiring local, whether students, fishermen coming through, getting hands-on learning. And at the same time, cruise ship passengers or people getting off the plane looking for something fun to do, pay to visit our farm. If they're really excited, can adopt a coral or get reef restoration scuba certification. And then we basically are monetizing our operations to fund more restoration work. And so we're envisioning this huge opportunity to shift how people value nature and ultimately pay for it. And then really tap into a lot of these conservation financing mechanisms that are starting to emerge, like blue bonds, reef insurance policies, literally for coral reefs, and a whole number of things that we think can rapidly and importantly scale up the funding in a sustainable fashion to do large-scale restoration work that's required.
Well, it sounds like there's, I don't know if tension is the right word, but this challenge of developing the coral farm for the first project, and also placing that within this larger ecosystem of new financing tools that are, involving multinational corporations, multinational government agencies, and sort of initiatives. How do you navigate that space?
We're getting into the role of chief reef now. It's complicated. I mean, like, my job has got many different roles to it. Sometimes it's helping with the marketing, sometimes it's fundraising, sometimes it's business development, sometimes it's reaching out to executives at the World Bank.
Sorry, Sam, I think we may have lost you for when you were actually answering my question, and maybe it was just because the question was a bad question and you didn't want to answer it, which is fine. No, you cut out at the beginning.
That's what family's for, right? Is to skip the things we don't want to talk about. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
All right. So, would you just repeat the question then, just because I?
Yeah, I was saying, it seems like there's this tension of you're building something very, very local, and a series of local projects, or local initiatives. At the same time, it's pushing sort of the the vanguard of pushing the nature, nature as a service, nature restoration, and alternative financing models. I'm curious, how do you thread that space between the very meta big picture financing initiatives to the on the ground projects? And how do you think about the development of the company in that context?
Yeah, it's a lot of things to balance. There's many hats that have to be worn. Part of it is sort of going back to my days when I was studying political science and wanting to go in diplomacy and like talking to, regulators in different countries and often senior officials to figure out what are their needs if we were going to build a farm in a place, and then executives at an insurance company to figure out how they're looking at structuring their policies and what that would require from us for growing corals, to the physical operations of the farm itself and managing personnel, to the marketing. And so there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of visioneering that's required, because again, we're not able to like say, oh, this is how the market operates, so we can just come in and do things differently. We're effectively building the market. And so the way I often like to think about it is it's almost like being in the sandbox. Like I want to put this thing here and see how that relates to this thing there and play it around, and the wave could come wash it away for sure, which we did experience during a hurricane. But it is, there's a lot of room for us just kind of, you saying the vanguard is a good way of putting it, is like, well, this is how we think things should be. So let's move things forward and see how that goes. And then align that with the stuff we see emerge. I mean, we're not developing any financing instruments, but we're talking to the people who are developing blue bonds. I formerly worked for the Seychelles ambassador to the UN and the US, who worked on specifically climate change. And the Seychelles was one of the first places to try out this debt for adaptation swap, where foreign debt held by European nations was forgiven if the Seychelles spent money on conservation and adaptation programs. We're not operating the Seychelles, but knowing that they're looking at projects like ours is a perfect example of how to spend that money, then helps us inform how we should develop the business strategy together with direct payment as a service. And so it's a very long-winded way of saying it's evolving, it changes day to day. It's super exciting, but I think there's a real opportunity to then also, I think it's worth mentioning, aligning with, this has actually been announced, 2021 was the start of the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And they also launched the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative like a year and a half ago. And so tying those things together with our direct business model, and then meeting with cruise ship executives about, COVID aside, with cruise ships, sending their guests directly to our farm. Yeah, it depends on what day you ask me, but it all is a balancing act with a tremendous amount of unexpected twists and turns and very cool opportunities at the same time.
Well, maybe this is a good opportunity. So that's a good preview of doing a tour around the farm. And then I imagine, one, there'll be more questions after that, and two, questions from participants to sort of flesh out some of the details. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that works. So I'm going to dial in from my phone, so it'll be easier to wield during the tour. As I get that set up, I just thought I'd mention also for the audience, because it's something we'll touch in for the tour. The two of the things that are really exciting from our end, from a scientific perspective. Again, coral farming has been around for about 20 years. I said earlier, think of it almost like reforestation. You take cuttings of living coral that you then transplant, like grafting with flowers or trees. Some corals, to go from the size of a coin to this speaker, could take 20 or 30 years. Some to go to the size of a dinner plate could take a century. So there's a lot of species traditionally that restoration practitioners don't grow. We teamed up with some of the world's leading scientists, and we're incorporating one of the methods that we use is called microfragmenting, where we can grow corals up to 50 times faster, so that we can now grow corals to this size in 1 or 2 years instead of 20 or 50. And then at the same time, also strengthen the resiliency to threats that are killing them and moving forward. One of them really is warming oceans from climate change. So as I go through this farm tour, and I'll show you some of these things in a much more exciting to actually see corals growing. In addition to the business model, the other key innovations that we at Coral Vita are doing is incorporating these breakthrough methods that are being developed largely by scientific partners, but we also have our own R&D and stuff going on too. And then the fact that I'm walking you around the farm that it's on land, as opposed to going out in the ocean, which is a fun day at the office and going to an underwater garden. But the idea also is that rather than having to set up and maintain lots of underwater nurseries near every reef you want to restore, if we have enough land, we can expand this farm to grow all the corals required to restore reefs throughout the Bahamas. And that's kind of the scale we want to get to, and then start putting farms like that all around the world. So I'm gonna now take you to the fun part. And we're gonna go to the farm.
Great. While Sam is walking over there, if anyone has questions, I think you can enter them in the chat, and then we'll, we're glad to ask them.
So I had promised the other panelists that I would also make sure that people got to see the palm trees and the like. So here at the farm, we're based.
And we're not. Oh, perfect.
Now
Yep, you're good.
It wouldn't be a proper trip to the Bahamas without some palm trees. So we're based here on the canal system, and basically going out that way, past our boats and around. You're in about 10 minutes, you're at the Coral Reef. So we got a really great clean source of seawater behind us, which helps pump and sort of power the coral farm. So we're gonna walk over this way and I'm gonna show you some of the corals that are growing. But basically what we're doing is, the simplest way of describing it is we can either create the spa treatment or the gym treatment for our corals. So the spa treatment is just creating the right temperatures, pH, levels of sunlight to just make the corals happy so that they'll grow. But then what we also are doing is looking at how can we toughen them up? Because one of the key things that's stressing out corals already, and is going to only get worse moving forward in the future, is warming and acidifying oceans. And that's largely driven by climate change. And so we can also take the corals to the gym. And what I mean by that is that in these tanks, we've got the seawater pumping through. These are staghorn corals. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a second. But what we can do is we can not just give them the spa treatment, but look at what scientists are projecting for future ocean temperatures here in the Bahamas in 2030 or 2075. And we can crank up the temperature and lower the temperature, modify the pH, and basically stress test the corals and see which ones do well. And then corals also akin kind of to vegetation, they make babies, they breed. It's kind of like pollination. And we can crossbreed these native coral species between the ones that are already heat tolerant to make more hardy corals for outplanting. But even for the ones that don't necessarily do really well, we're still boosting their resilience. Corals have a natural ability to adapt. Things are just getting so bad so quickly in the ocean that they can't catch up. So we'll still be able to toughen up all the corals so that when we outplant them, put them back in the reefs and conditions deteriorate, they still will survive better than their sort of cousin corals that were just growing out there naturally. So what we basically do is we go out on the reefs, we collect pieces of corals, and then we bring them and put them in these tanks. Now, I described earlier how some of the corals grow really slow. There are others that grow really fast, and I'm going to show you examples of both. So this is, as I said, a staghorn coral, aptly called because it looks like deer's antlers. And these grow really fast on their own. So you can see like one of these branches here, to get to this size, from the size of say your thumb, could take 6-9 months. It grows pretty quickly. So that's why we have some of these in much smaller fragments like this one, and then they'll grow it to the size that they're basically ready to plant back out in the reefs within a year or less. The problem though is that many coral species, as I described before, which are really important for reducing wave energy, for providing fish habitat, grow much, much slower. So over here, we've got what are known as mustard-heeled corals. And you can see that this one I'm about to pick up, it's about the size of my hand. And to get this to the size of this coral I'm holding from, say, a coin could take decades. And for what we're dealing with, we're trying to do ecologically feasible and financially sustainable restoration to really keep reefs alive and to do it holistically with lots of species. That rate of growth just doesn't really cut it. So that brings us back to the accelerated growth rates I was talking about before. So I'm going to take us over to another tank, assuming I can find it right here, which basically is a great illustration of how we grow these corals. What was discovered was that if you cut up coral into these little tiny pieces, it basically cartridge. And if you put these corals from the same original here near each other, it triggers the healing process, and they'll start fusing back into themselves. And so, as we were describing before, this little piece of coral right here came from one of those big handle-sized ones I showed earlier. So normally to grow from this size to that size, again, decades. But there's this healing process that's happening. And so that one was just recently cut. But you can already see on this plug I'm holding here, let me know if you can't, but it's already fusing over the sides of this plug. And that rate of growth is like 10 times faster than ever in nature. And so we're basically able to rapidly accelerate growth rates.
Hey, Sam. Sorry, I think you're speaking right into the wind. I think is picking up. It's a little hard to hear you.
Is this better?
Yeah.
All right, so as an easier example maybe to see, so this is a piece of cement in my hand, but then there's these 3 plugs that have the coral on them, and you can see this one on the top, it's already growing over the rock. And that should have taken, several years to grow that quickly in the wild. And that piece of coral was cut about 7 or 8 months ago, and it's already fusing over. So the idea is that we can put all these little pieces near each other and they're still growing into themselves. And we can basically bring, a centuries old dead coral skeleton effectively back to its health in a matter of 1 or 2 years as opposed to decades. And so all of this happens here at the coral farm, and then after 6, 12, 18 months, we'll then take these corals out to the reefs and put them back out, and the reef will already start coming back to life. You'll start seeing changes in the amount of fish that are out there, and have the impact that we want to see. So the other part of that, just since there was some questions earlier about the business, as I said, we turn this into a tourism attraction and education facility. Oh my God. Got some of our staff right now checking out some of the corals. So we have, because of COVID, not operational right now, so it's a bit more of a construction site vibe, but this area is the welcome center. And so when people are looking for things to do on the island, they can come visit this really interactive coral farm, and then we ground them in why do coral reefs matter, what's happened to them, and then bring them on a tour of the farm. And over that way, we've got a cafe. We're building a new touch tank system, and all of basically that tourism revenue can help fund our operations as we're growing corals for restoration and as we're negotiating those restoration service contracts. And the last piece I want to show everyone here in terms of the scale, if we had full capacity with the tanks I showed you right now, we could grow about 20,000 corals a year. It's probably going to get windy for a second, so just stop me if you need me to. We really need millions and billions of corals being grown annually to keep reefs alive for the future until we figure out how to stop killing them through solving climate change and ending pollution away. So eventually, this is our pilot farm. This is farm number 1. And rather than being able to grow 20,000 corals or so, we're actually going to be expanding into this sort of excavated plot of land so that we can grow 100,000 or more corals every year and supply restoration projects throughout the whole country in the Bahamas, and then eventually grow 1 million corals here. And then we want to start putting farms of that scale in all our ultimate goal is in every country with coral reefs around the world, through the Caribbean, to the Pacific, to the Indian Ocean, and help keep reefs alive and help galvanize this sort of restoration economy that we really think is required to protect ecosystems, but at the same time also is a really big market opportunity at the same time. So that in a nutshell is the coral farm, and in here is just our sort of laboratory and office area where we get to do some of our science experiments too.
Sam, that's great. And now we're seeing two of you. So lots of questions. Well, let's start with this one. And I'm sorry, I don't know who these are from, but thank you for asking. Question one is, could you talk a little more on the science side? So what unique research, unique tech that you're able to share are you using that helps expedite growth? There was a question, sort of, you talked about fragmenting. Is that the only one? Is there additional tech that you're using, additional sort of unique research that helps do what you do, at the, more efficiently?
So the microfragmenting method I described is what underpins the accelerated growth rates. The thing I think to keep in mind is that a lot of this it's still very nascent. So coral farming itself has been around for a while, but most projects around the world, again, grew corals out in the ocean. I showed the sort of faster growing species, the staghorn corals, the ones that look like deer's antlers. Most projects focus on those. So the baseline we're working from is fairly, it's not that advanced, to put it that way. So right now, microfragmenting is really what powers a lot of our diversification and accelerated growth rates. We are, though, excited to get our own experiments and R&D going. So we're looking into something we're referring to as a happy tank. So we're figuring out ways where, okay, if we cut the corals into diamonds, or if we cut them into trapezoids, or if we cut them at this part of the coral versus that part of the coral, does that have any impacts on if they grow faster or if they survive better? We're looking into incorporating, not right now, but down the road, robotics. There's a company, one of our investors is Tom Chi, who's a co-founder of Google X, and he's really put a lot of effort into sort of upscaling high impact, particularly environmental solutions. One of his companies that he's invested in is Ironox, which is an indoor farming company that's using robotics. And so right now, people are going hand by hand, cleaning the corals and inspecting them. And we're looking at ways that we might be able to upscale and automate that. That leads to healthier corals and more efficiencies for our work. Not anything particularly massive for what I'm sure many of you have seen, but we recently got a 3D printer. And we're exploring new ways to basically design these plugs that the corals grow on that, again, might also promote better growth rates or other sort of key features. So there's a lot of room for R&D and ingenuity. And then another part of what we do, which is really important, is we're all about collaboration. We're like, this is a team effort to protect the reefs. We can't be the only ones doing this. We hope we're not the only business that's going to be doing this. So for now, we're the only commercial land-based coral farming company that exists. But we have a lot of collaborations with scientific institutes and researchers, and many of whom have some really advanced projects going on. There are people that are looking at CRISPR, gene editing for corals, among many others. We don't know if that'll work. We also don't know what the unintended consequences may be, since human beings do have a good track record in that field. But knowing that that kind of work is happening, and if it's proven out to be viable, we can then bring that into what we do. So yeah, lots of cool science and R&D happening. But the baseline for how we operate right now is primarily microfragmenting and then acclimatization for strengthening the corals.
So you mentioned one of the sort of pieces is the planting the coral itself. So there was a question around, what does that look like? How do you actually do that? But then sort of supplemental to that, thinking about how are you evaluating whether it's successful? Like how do the counterparties, the hotels, the ships, cruise ships, How do you tell outside of looking at it and seeing, oh, the coral's growing? Is there a sort of a more detailed assessment and validation technique or sort of third parties that you're contracting with to do that?
Yes, there are lots of metrics we use. I'll go into those in a sec. As far as outplanting goes, there's a few different ways of doing it, but the most straightforward and common that we do is you just go down with underwater drills where coral was living. We'll always evaluate, speaking of metrics, we always make sure it's the right place for restoration. Not every reef can be restored, so we will evaluate that beforehand. But basically drill holes into the limestone rock that was out there, and then imagine this plug had a coral on it. You take a non-toxic marine epoxy glue, put it on the end of the coral, plug that into the hole, it dries, and then the coral will grow on over itself. I mean, that's, like I said, there are other ways, but that's the primary approach. As far as metrics go, yeah, there's a lot of things we use to evaluate. It's not just a matter of how many corals we plant, but how many corals survive, do they reproduce, what are the changes in marine life? So being able to evaluate, before we did this restoration project, there was this prevalence of fish species and diversity. Afterwards, there's this much more, and typically related to planted they will come type of thing. That's a huge impact that restoration can have, in particular on marine populations beyond just the corals themselves. When I lived in Mauritius, there was a project where it was in a lagoon that had been abandoned 10 years prior by the fishermen because the reefs were dead and there weren't any fish. And they were setting up their traps 100 yards away from the nursery there because of the changes that had occurred from restoration. Depending on how advanced of a project it is, if there's more engineering involved, reduction in wave energy. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we engage in as far as monitoring and evaluating. How often we do that, we'll always cook in a certain amount, whether it's every the first like 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. But if a hotel wanted to sort of pay, like, call it a maintenance fee for ongoing monitoring, that's something that we also can sort of build in. We will always have at least a baseline, though, evaluation to be able to say this was a successful project and how successful was it.
Great. Gonna combine a question and something that I know is probably on a lot of people's minds, and that I know that you've thought about a lot. One of the questions was, who are the type of investors that you brought to the table? Are they primarily philanthropically oriented? Are they angels? Is it a mix? But I think taking that a step further and thinking about, like, you're building a business, in a really innovative space, and as we've talked about, sort of the vanguard of new financing mechanisms in a big picture. What have you seen as like challenges of supporting entrepreneurs and helping entrepreneurs at sort of the stage that you're at sort of get to where you are, and then also thinking about sort of moving forward, sort of how we're thinking about the funding ecosystem? What could be done differently? How could we be approaching that space differently?
Well, I'll start there. My biggest critique of the impact investing community is, well, I guess two biggest is, one, is I still don't really know what an impact investor is, because it depends on who you talk to, what it means. But most importantly, there needs to be more impact angels. So we've now, between 2 rounds and sort of prizes and awards and the like, have raised almost $4 million. So we're over this hurdle. I'm not sort of saying this on our, but having gone through it and having still seeing what so many people are going through, there's a massive gap between sort of like initial grant funding and what most impact investors will write checks for. And as an example, there's one investor who's got an ocean fund. We've been talking to them for 5 years. One of their principles is visit our farm. It's not sort of just like, oh, you're too small, we'll talk to you, and then we never hear from them again. They genuinely are interested in what we're doing and want to see it succeed. But like, we were raising a $2 million round, and their minimum check size was $2 million. They weren't going to be to fully fund the round themselves. We started off with a $1,000 grant from Yale while we were in grad school, and then a $15,000 grant. I appreciate with the third Teicher, who's not here, my brother Seth. He was a VC, so I also appreciate from the venture capitalist perspective, you only have so much bandwidth, a portfolio, lots of early stage investments. complicate things, and you're probably not getting as better returns or reducing that risk. But there's a chicken and an egg scenario so often where they're like, we love what you're doing, but we want to invest on your larger scale. It's like, well, how do you get to larger scale if no one's going to write the check? And the number of times I've also seen like governments or the World Bank or UN being like, we want to see all these projects, but where are the entrepreneurs? And the entrepreneurs are like, well, we're here, but you won't support us because we're not at the scale you need. So that, I think, just as far as my soapbox, we navigated through that, but there's so many people with amazing solutions that are solving urgent and pressing needs, and I think lucrative ones, but people just won't write them the checks they need to get to that next stage. For us, it was a blend. It was a mix of sort of more philanthropic, call them impact angels, people with big checkbooks who believed in the mission and wanted to see it succeed. We've had one or two venture capitalists invest in us, and sort of traditional impact investors. Yale invested in us. We had a professional athlete that he and his wife loved to scuba dive, so there was a personal connection. So for us, it definitely was a blend between many different partners. But the other thing I think that's key is also that everyone was recognizing that this was a 10 to 15 year type of investment, not a 5 to 7 year sort of traditional VC play. And that what we're proposing, and this is very sort of more unique to Coral Vita than necessarily other social entrepreneurs, but given we're trying to basically create a market together with the business, people seeing a lot of upside financially, but really investing first and foremost in our mission, the belief that this is something that needs to happen and that it can be lucrative, that type of impact investor, not, oh, this is solving an SDG and it's also going to be a super successful business. It was definitely a belief that what we're proposing is something that aligns with their core values and then can get some financial returns. And that goes back to that original point I've made where I often see a lot of what I call the VCs masquerading as impact investors, and that's fine. I'm not like, it's confusing as a social entrepreneur to know who I'm talking to, because an impact investor to me does not mean someone who's looking to get venture level returns, but that's also just my own opinion. That's how we've sort of navigated through all of that.
You mentioned the collaboration piece, and I think both on the sort of other so like directly in the space, and that you don't want to be the only company that's doing this. I'm curious in terms of sort of where you're at, and sort of not collaboration as a sort of developing out a sort of regeneration or a blue economy ecosystem on a local level. Is that like, what's that look like? And do you see that as a sort of value add as you look at growing this and scaling up to a million corals, for sort of a much larger farm?
Yeah, there's lots of room for collaboration. I mean, whether it's the other restoration practitioners, as one example, we often get asked who are your competitors. And in one sense, you could look at the sort of established NGOs who usually do coral restoration. They're our competitor. But one, we have a good relationship with almost all of them. And two, we actually see more co-opetition, where if they're setting up these ocean-based farms that only can grow the fast-growing species, well, they could use their limited grant dollars rather than setting them and maintaining these nurseries that are limited to buy our more diverse and resilient corals. Or right now we grow and install the corals. Maybe we just grow and then we contract them out to do the physical planting and restoration work. That's as far as one example of the other people who are working in the space right now. There's also obviously rooms to like align around sort of national economic development plans that are focused on the sustainable development goals of the blue economy. We're actually part of a group that we kind of helped initiate that's trying to launch something called the Blue Action Lab here in Grand Bahama. We as Coral Vita, we're looking for where we want to put farm number one. Ultimately, we want to do this around the world, but for the first farm, we needed a good partner. We needed a good place to test the business model, and that had the ecological need. And we found a partner here in the Grand Bahama Port Authority that gave us expedited permits. We got coral restoration permits through the government in 6 months instead of 6 years, which is what it would have been like in Florida. We got land for next to nothing because they have a vision for conservation and sustainable development. So basically, it's a great place for pilot farm one to scale globally. So this collaborative nature of what we're doing has led us to help the sort of inspiration behind this Blue Action Lab, where other ocean-focused entrepreneurs can come to Grand Bahama and use it as a proving ground to then scale up globally and align with what investors and governments and customers and the environment and also local communities need and are looking for. So yeah, there's tons of room for not just doing this on our own. It can't just be done on our own. And that's not just in reference to coral restoration, but social enterprises, galvanizing the restoration economy, figuring out how to align incentives, navigate rules and regulations from governments, and sort of kickstart all of this so that people and planet really can benefit from the types of innovators and entrepreneurs that are out there that are trying to scale their solutions.
That's great. You mentioned this at the beginning, that you were down there during the hurricanes, that was a challenge for the company. There was a question on sort of what happens, and then how do you plan for that going forward, knowing that with the extreme climate change, there's going to be more hurricanes, there's going to be more extreme weather events. How do you grow the business knowing that that's going to be something that's going to be affecting you more and more?
It's an important question. We designed our farm with hurricanes in mind. We actually designed it for Cat 5 hurricanes. And Dorian was the strongest storm to ever hit the Bahamas. It's one of the strongest storms in recorded history. And we had 225 mile an hour winds here, almost for 2 days. Most hurricanes last for 4 to 8 hours. Dorian lasted for 48 hours as we parked on top of Grand Bahama. Buildings all stood tall. They all held up. Unfortunately, sitting there for 48 hours during 5 high tides and a king tide, and where our farm is located on this sort of canal, we had a lot of water. And when we built the farm, we again sited it with sea level rise and flooding in mind. And what people basically told us here is like, you don't need to worry about flooding. Listen, if it floods at your farm, don't worry about your farm because the whole island's underwater. And that's exactly what happened during Dorian. And so we were more than double the 100-year flood event where we built the farm at like 9 feet to the foundation. And we had almost 20 feet of storm surge. So where I am right now is completely under the ocean. There's only so much you can do to design for that. But we, on the early stage of the company, learning those lessons earlier on is advantageous. So we have a whole protocol for how we take care of the corals. We had a hurricane that came through this past August. No problems whatsoever as far as for the corals and for the farm and our staff and personnel as well. So yeah, it's a thing that needs to get navigated, but it also if nothing else, reinforced the need for our work. We saw mangroves and coral reefs literally save people's lives because they reduced wave energy enough to let people get to higher ground or to their neighbor's house. So it was difficult to go through that, and we've learned some hard lessons, but it also was a reinforcement about the importance of our work. And really, it was after Hurricane Dorian that we launched this $2 million round. Basically, we can't just go back to the pilot. Let's take the next step forward and scale up our farm to a world-class facility so that we can start putting them in other locations. And I don't advise staying for a Cat 5 hurricane. I was here for it, and the most fun I never want to have again. And there wasn't a lot of fun, but it was a firm reminder of how to design better and also why our work is needed.
Yeah. Well, we were glad that you were okay after that. So we're going to wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. Anything else that we haven't covered so far that you want to make sure that we cover? Whether in terms of developing the business, thinking about the science. I think there was one other question. There's a disease affecting caiman corals called the stony coral tissue loss. There's a very specific question. Do you have the same problem down there, and does the coral gym help?
Yes, unfortunately, after Hurricane Dorian, it showed up. So double-edged whammy for us. And then also the islands, Grand Bahama and Abaco, were just kind of getting on their feet come March, and then we're opening up again, and then COVID came through. So there's a pandemic under the ocean as well. There are coral diseases. There have been coral diseases for a long time. Most of them affect 1 to 2% of corals, and over months or years will kill part of a sort of coral stand. This new disease that was mentioned, stony coral tissue loss disease, it's fairly novel. It's only been around since 2014. We don't really know what causes it or what caused it, but given some correlations, it emerged around the Port of Miami, right when there was a dredging project that went bad in the Port of Miami. Safe to say, humans had a role in it. It affects 50% of species, and pretty much once the coral gets infected, it's going to die within months at the most, which is pretty heartbreaking to see centuries-old corals dying before your eyes. And yeah, now it's here. It's still very much not understood even how it's transmitted. There are some of the best coral disease researchers in the world working on it. That does not include us. So we've actually shifted our growing strategy, so we're not growing corals right now that are susceptible. And we're basically waiting for the disease to burn out or until a solution emerges, so that we're not, wasting the lives of the corals or our time or potentially contaminating our system, which is tough because we were growing 24 species of coral before Hurricane Dorian and before this disease showed up. Now we're growing 8 species, and that is largely because of this disease. So it's another challenge to be thrown in the mix, but there are people who are looking at coral probiotics, again, an advantage. We can't describe this at all yet, but like we think an advantage by having the land-based system is that having those controlled tanks, if a probiotic is useful, we're able to just introduce that right into the water system. That could potentially be beneficial, but it still is a lot of unknowns there.
That's scary. So I will throw back the previous question of anything. What would you like from the audience? If people want to support the work that you're doing, I think the question was sort of specifically, are you looking to raise more money? Are there any other ways that people can get involved? Should people come down once COVID restrictions are lifted and, come visit? What are ways that people can tangibly sort of support what you're doing and keep up to date on what, Coral Vita is, your work?
Well, we would love for people to come down. The borders are open in the Bahamas. A few protocols you have to go through, but if people feel like traveling, it is a thing. But once COVID's over, please, come visit the farm, plant corals. One of the ways that we're navigating, there's no ecotourism now, and we do have 1 or 2 contracts in the works, but obviously people aren't really prioritizing reef restoration, paying for that when all these revenue streams have shut down for them. So we did launch an online Adopt a Coral campaign. You go to our website, you can check that out. I'd love if you could spread the word about that, because it's a way where people from wherever they are in the world can help fund restoration work and then give a gift for birthday, the holidays, to sort of someone they care about. We do still have about 100,000 or so left to raise in this round. But we're always about building collaborations, whether that's with conservation financiers, looking at future places for farms, scientists, engineers, marketing experts. There's a ton of ways. I'm always happy to have a conversation with anyone, because you never know where it'll lead. So if anyone in the audience has just ideas about maybe this person or this thing is something you should check out, or have a conversation with them, I'm always open to that and appreciative. And I'd say the other thing in terms of sort of a call to action, I'm given this community beyond just us for Coral Vita, what I said before is really, one, look at the restoration economy and ecosystem restoration. I think is an amazing opportunity to solve so many different issues and just bring our planet back to life. But then also consider how we can solve this chicken and egg impact angel early stage funding gap, because it is limiting so much impact that's possible and that's needed. That's my high level call to action. And then, you can sign up for our newsletter. If you go to our website, follow us on social media. We often post things in the newsletter, whether it's more specific calls to action, news about the farm, ways you can help spread the word. There's a number of different things. So I appreciate everyone who's tuning in right now and asking that question.
Sam, thank you so much. This is fascinating. It's a great way to start the week, and I think what hopefully will be a very exciting week this week. So a great way to start that. Thanks for everything that you're doing and for your time right now. And to Carolyn and to Impact Capital Forum, thanks for the opportunity to chat with Sam and really explore the restoration economy and Coral Vita in more depth.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Perry. That was so great. It was a great educational experience to learn more about all the great work that you're doing down there, Sam. And kudos to you. Please feel free, I guess, to echo Nayloon's question, what we can do to further help and support your efforts. Adopt a Coral is a great initiative, and we'll definitely share that in our social media channels.
I just put my email in the chat and our website if anyone wants to check it out. Carolyn and Perry, thanks so much. I wish I could bring you all to the Bahamas, but I hope you enjoyed the virtual experience. And yeah, hope everyone has a great week, and look forward to planting corals with y'all one day soon.
Thanks.
Thanks.